only pure thing in this world.
3 years ago, I sat down to watch Avatar: The Way of Water with one big question on my mind. Could James Cameron deliver a sequel to his 2009 blockbuster that was worth a 13-year wait? Well, 3 hours and 12 minutes later, it was abundantly clear that, yep, dude still got it. Earlier this month, when I sat down to watch Avatar: Fire and Ash, I had a lot more questions. A couple were about loose ends from the previous film, but my more pressing ones were about the movie itself. Would a new Avatar film, after just 3 years, pack as much of a punch as one that had a middle schooler's lifetime of anticipation? And Cameron's made some of the best sequels of all time, but what does a James Cameron threequel look like? Well, 3 hours and 17 minutes later, I didn't have quite as definitive of an answer, but I did have one huge smile on my face. Avatar: Fire and Ash picks up immediately after the events of The Way of Water. Jake, Neytiri, and the rest of the Sully family are mourning the loss of their eldest son, Neteyam. They've finally been accepted into the Metkayina clan, but aside from the looming threat of retaliation from the RDA, there are a couple other factors preventing them from properly settling down. For one, Jake's favorite form of grieving involves preparing for war with the humans, which the Metkayina clan isn't really wild about. And two, the Sullys have a kid who can't breathe. Their adopted son Spider still needs a rebreather to survive in Pandora's atmosphere, and they've only got one backup battery, which, to put it lightly, is just stupidly risky. So Jake makes the unpopular call that Spider should go live with their human friends, and to soften the blow, proposes they make a family vacation out of it by hitching a ride with the nomadic airborne Tlalim clan, aka the Wind Riders. Aside from all the grieving, Fire and Ash looks and feels very similar to The Way of Water in the early going. While that's by no means a bad thing, it's initially lacking in the spectacle, novelty, or for lack of a better word, newness I was hoping from another Avatar. However, that very quickly changes with the arrival of the Wind Traders. The Avatar movies have always been a visual feast, but an armada of vessels suspended from enormous flying jellyfish-like medusoids pulled by cephalopodian wind rays literally and figuratively blows the more familiar imagery out of the water, especially in 3D on a massive screen. Cameron has always had a flair for large-scale spectacle, but I was equally impressed with the shots of the Wind Traders hawking their wares. In terms of narrative or action, nothing particularly exciting takes place in these handful of shots, but they're so densely packed with detail, activity, and stuff that I sat forward in my seat. Fire and Ash isn't nearly as drastic a visual leap forward as The Way of Water was compared to the first film, which is to be expected, but these brief busy shots of Na'vi knickknacks almost feel like a tech demo or foreshadowing for the sheer visual density of Fire and Ash's later scenes. But anyway, if you're not as impressed by baskets and gourds at a Na'vi swap meet as I am, don't worry, because the Fire Nation shows up soon enough and things get interesting. They are the Manquan clan, a ruthless and quite literally godless group of Na'vi led by Varang, played by Una Chaplin, who is one of the highlights of the film. Chaplin's performance is properly terrifying, and her whole crew looks and acts more like denizens of Mordor than people you'd find on Pandora. Varang has no qualms about breaking Eywa's laws and is extremely eager to get her hands on human weapons. And you know who has access to a whole lot of those and a similar penchant for torching Na'vi villages? Miles Quaritch, so they hit it off like gasoline and an open flame. When Quaritch showed up in the first film, I didn't think he was anything to write home about. Stephen Lang gave a decent enough performance as an extremely hateable badass, but when it was announced that he was attached for all 4 sequels, it didn't really move the needle for me. However, his performance in Fire and Ash has elevated him to one of my favorite villains in recent memory, especially in the scenes opposite Una Chaplin. The two of them do not chew scenery, they devour it like a 5-course meal, and it's a delight to watch. Another character who unexpectedly grew on me was Spider, which is good because he's basically the linchpin of this whole film. In The Way of Water, he's introduced as the annoying neighborhood kid who's always hanging around, somewhere between the Simpsons' Milhouse Van Houten and Eli Cash and the Royal Tenenbaums. In Fire and Ash, Spider is part of the family, and I found Jack Champion's performance to be fully endearing, with similar measures of earnestness and obnoxiousness as Edward Furlong as John Connor in T2 Judgment Day. Speaking of which, Cameron has given us some of the most badass moms in movie history. Neytiri definitely kicks some ass in The Way of Water, but it pales in comparison to one particularly explosive sequence that puts her right up there with Ellen Ripley in a power loader or Sarah Connor racking a shotgun one-handed. Zoe Saldana has always been a highlight of these films, but she is in top form here. My one hang-up about Fire and Ash, if you could even call it that, is that it gave me a sense of déjà vu. Some of the visuals and story beats tread very close to those of the previous films, to the point that they almost feel like deleted scenes or alternate takes intercut with new material. But looking at Cameron's past work, it's safe to assume this is a feature, not a bug. George Lucas once described the Star Wars prequel trilogy's relationship to the original by saying it's like poetry, they rhyme. I would argue that James Cameron's approach to sequels has a tendency to amplify and echo. Rather than taking a familiar concept, theme, or visual and presenting it as a flipped mirror image version, his sequels usually take something we know and present a grander, more operatic version of it. Once more with feeling, as the saying goes. But Fire and Ash is the first Part 3 he's ever done, so I wasn't sure how it'd shake out. Does it get louder? Does it rhyme? Does it do something completely different? For instance, watching the Terminator and Terminator 2 back to back, they both open on tandem time travelers, escalate into shootouts and truck chases, and then culminate in factory showdowns. Alien and Aliens both feature a crew investigating a distress signal on LV-426, taking some casualties, misreading a motion tracker with terrifying results, and both have a tense final sequence in which a flamethrower-toting Ripley rescues a loved one before blowing a xenomorph stowaway out an airlock. In both cases, these similarities are obscured by better effects, incredible action sequences, great characters, and the delightful twist that unlike in the first film, where a scary android character tries to murder the heroine, this time the android is her friend instead.
Come with me if you want to live.
The Way of Water didn't subvert Avatar as much as it did submerge it. Jake's training sequence and rite of passage to join the Omaticaya clan in the first film happens all over again underwater with the Metkayina. But The Way of Water does have its share of twists. In the first film, Jake earns the Omatikaya's respect by bonding with the vicious killer pterodactyl that everyone fears and respects. In the second film, Jake's son is shunned when he bonds with a huge murderer whale that they all fear and hate because of complicated underwater politics. In both cases, the big cool animal shows up in the final battle and saves the day. A lot of The Way of Water was spent establishing new characters, relationships, stakes, and rules, but in Fire and Ash, the groundwork has been laid, so everything kinda hits the ground running. Cameron does plenty of his trademark supersizing of existing ideas, but the new film rhymes as well. For example, Quaritch's relationship with Varang is like a twisted reimagining of how Jake and Neytiri started out, and as much of a thrill as all the visual spectacle and action sequences are, it's just as cool seeing that juxtaposed with Jake and Neytiri, who are long past the honeymoon phase and honestly seem pretty exhausted. When watching Fire and Ash, it's hard not to compare it to third installments and other notable sci-fi and fantasy movie franchises, and it kept reminding me of a couple of all-timers. As a direct continuation of The Way of Water, it's reminiscent of Return of the King's escalation in the wake of the Two Towers. That's not to say that Fire and Ash has multiple false endings, but rather that it's got some truly epic battle scenes and enough plot threads going on at once to keep it from dragging, but not so many that it's difficult to track who's doing what at any given point. Cameron's got some wonderful new toys to play with on screen, courtesy of the army of artists at Weta, and he gets plenty of mileage out of those, but for a few scenes he also drags out a couple huge Tupperware tubs full of action figures, vehicles, and playsets made for the first two films and dumps their contents into the mix. In that sense, Fire and Ash's big final battle reminded me of how Return of the Jedi's Battle of Endor is like a souped-up spin on A New Hope's grand finale. Yeah, it's got some familiar elements, but the sheer volume of other stuff flying around the screen makes that feel like a stupid thing to get hung up on. With the exception of bright orange explosions and the occasional vat of yellow molten steel, Cameron's earlier films make such heavy use of the color blue that it's almost a running joke. However, Fire and Ash, despite its two-tone namesake, makes use of the full visible spectrum to great effect. There are a few psychedelic scenes that push the boundaries of that even, but ironically, seeing 3D CGI renditions of the effects of hallucinogens is somehow less hallucinogenic than the rest of the movie. Enough has been said about how much Avatar films need to be seen in theaters, but if you'll allow me to beat a dead dire horse for a moment, it's true, especially in 3D. As was the case with The Way of Water, some scenes are in a higher frame rate than others, and the transition can be occasionally jarring, but that is a pretty minor nitpick considering how genuinely stunning everything else on the screen looks at any given point. Avatar: Fire and Ash is getting a 9. It isn't the technical leap forward its predecessor was, which is to be expected after 3 years instead of 13, but what it lacks in novelty it more than makes up for with refinement on every level. The planet Pandora feels slightly less alien, and its denizens have gotten a lot more familiar, but James Cameron has given them, and his first trilogy, an immensely gratifying finale that is well worth the wait.
This world goes much deeper than you imagine.
That's what I thought of Avatar: Fire and Ash. If you're looking to get up to speed with everything that happened in the first two movies, be sure to check out my recap, and if you'd like to take a look back at the long history of games based on another James Cameron series, check out the best, worst, and weirdest Terminator video games. For all things movies, gaming, and everything in between, keep it locked to IGN.